Hello Tristan, welcome to Echoes of History. I was trying to rack my brains before, and I'm not sure you and I have ever actually done a podcast together before, so this is a moment for me.
It is a moment for me as well. We're like two ships in the night, aren't we? We host our separate podcasts, and we could never really quite find the opportunity to work side by side. But now we do have the opportunity to talk about the Parthenon today. So welcome. You have finally been brought into the light that is ancient history rather than medieval history. So welcome.
I thought you were going to say make a Dark Ages comment then. I was going to have to get upset about.
Not just yet. I don't want to upset you right at the start.
So we're here today to talk about the Parthenon, which is a building that is in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It's a building you can climb and you can run through and you can explore. So just to start us off with a real basic knowledge, because I don't know anything about ancient history, so I'm here to learn. What is the Parthenon and where is it?
The Parthenon is, it's sometimes heralded as the eighth wonder of the world. I'm not really a big fan of those labels because it's sometimes attributed to the Colosseum, and let's be honest, they're much more than seven wonders of the ancient world. And it is certainly a wonder. It's this beautiful ancient Greek temple constructed in the 5th century BC in Athens. It's normally the poster building when someone is talking about ancient Greece, classical Athens, and it is, in regards to its architecture and its art, one of the most stunning surviving examples of classical art and architecture from the ancient Greek, arguably the ancient Mediterranean world. So it is absolutely stunning. Its location, as mentioned earlier, it is in Athens, now the capital of Greece, and back in the 5th century BC was one of the most prominent city-states, arguably the most prominent city-state in the Greek world. It is placed atop a large rocky outcrop known as the Acropolis. That became basically the religious heart of classical Athens, and much of Athens is flat. So to have this great rocky outcrop in the centre, it was very much a very visual location for anyone approaching Athens, whether that be from sea or from land. So yes, it has become the symbol of classical art and architecture, I think you could very much argue, and one of the most memorable, one of the most recognisable ancient pieces of architecture surviving from classical Greece. And the classical Greece I'm talking about, the 5th century BC, but also the 4th century BC too.
Yeah, and incredible to think that something from that period that people would have sailed towards Athens in those days and looked at, you can still see and visit today. It's still there and still iconic. I'm going to say it's iconic. I also nearly jumped in your eighth wonder of the ancient world comment to say that surely you're the eighth wonder of the ancient world, Tristan, with the Ancients podcast.
Wow, flattery.
Before we get a little bit further into the Parthenon, the idea that this was a temple, this was a religious site, leads me into my complete lack of knowledge, really, of the Greek gods. So is the Parthenon dedicated to one particular god?
Well, the function of the Parthenon is actually a tricky topic, and some have even argued that it wasn't a temple in the slightest because there's no associated priesthood. However, one of our ancient sources who visited the Parthenon, this basically, think of him as an ancient travel writer, a man called Pausanias, when he visits it, he mentions it as a temple. So it almost certainly did have a religious function, but it also had a function as a treasury, which we'll almost certainly get into as well. But yes, it is named the Parthenon and after Athena Parthenos, so one of the most recognisable goddesses, well, deities of the ancient Greek pantheon of gods. And yeah, so let's kind of go into the pantheon of gods. So ancient Greeks, polytheistic, they worshipped a number of different gods. The most recognisable of them would arguably be the 12 or 13 Olympian deities that are mentioned time and time again. For instance, Zeus, king of the gods, you've got his wife Hera, then you've got likes of Athena, Dionysus, god of wine, he's always a fun one, Ares, Hephaestus, Apollo, Hermes, messenger of the gods, Aphrodite, and quite a few others. And then you get the gods in the underworld, like Hades and Persephone, Demeter too, Artemis. Those are perhaps the biggest deities that you think of ancient Greece, but then they also had a lot of deities that are less mentioned in the literature, the prime example being Hestia, goddess of the hearth. She was basically everywhere. I like sometimes calling her the mobile phone deity, because it is something that we all have today and we all use, but is kind of taken for granted almost. You don't talk about it as much because everyone knows what a mobile phone is. And Hestia is very much a goddess associated with everyday activities of an ancient Greek society, ancient Greek household. And then there are many other gods and goddesses as well that are brought into the pantheon. Helios, god of the sun, or Selene, goddess of the moon. And then you get lots of mythical creatures associated with the myths of certain gods and goddesses. And then demigods like Heracles too. So, long story short, from what I've just said there, the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses is a whole range of different deities ruling over different parts of the world, sometimes overlapping on certain parts of it, and they're very complicated figures. They're certainly not good guys, I think is the best way. All of these gods and goddesses have flaws that are very much mentioned, and you certainly, I think one of the overriding themes you get from all the myths of the Greek gods and goddesses, especially from the series we've recently done, is that you don't want to mess with one. You don't want to get on the wrong side of a gods and goddess, or because the vengeance is pretty horrific in many cases.
They sound quite human in that sense, that, they're fine while everybody's praising them and being very nice to them, but if you get on their wrong side, prepare to reap the whirlwind.
Well, exactly, yes. You want to appease the gods. I mean, the one that immediately goes to mind is the story of a hunter who sees one of the virgin goddesses alongside Athena, another one called Artemis, goddess of the hunt, sees her naked while she's bathing and kind of is a peeping Tom, looks at her, and then he's caught whilst he's doing that. He was hunting with his hunting dogs, and then he is transformed by Artemis into a stag, and then he is ripped apart by his hunting dogs. So yeah, that's just one. There are many, many myths and all that. But yes, pantheon of gods and goddesses, a huge range, lots of amazing myths and mythology surrounding them, hence why they are still so popular down to the present day.
And if anyone wants to know more about them, the Ancients podcast has done this whole fascinating long series of gods and goddesses where you can go and find out loads more about these individual gods and goddesses. I was going to say people, but they're not people. Just to position Athena then, she sits in that kind of top tier of the Greek gods and goddesses.
Yeah, she's in that 12 and 13 Olympian deities that I mentioned earlier. She's a fascinating one. I remember doing an interview on Athena with Rachel Kusser just over a year ago, and that was absolutely eye-opening. But I think she is most famously known as the goddess of wisdom, but she's also a virgin goddess, and she's also the goddess of war, goddess of skilled crafts, so weaving. Talking to Rachel about this, the thing that she says is kind of the underlying theme that can weave them all, if you pardon the pun, all of them together. She embodies strategic intelligence, whether, strategy in war, wisdom, but weaving as well. So strategic thinking in all of those things. And she becomes very closely aligned with Athens, which I'm sure we'll explain. But first of all, she has a fascinating birth story, one of the most bizarre birth stories of them all, Matt. She is the daughter of Zeus, and Zeus's first wife, who isn't Hera, it's a Titan, and Titans were the rulers of the heavens before the Olympian gods, and she's a woman called Metis. And Zeus, who has just taken over control from his father, Kronos, finds out that Metis is pregnant, and he fears that their child is going to overthrow him, like he did his father, and his father did his grandfather. There's a bit of a trend there in Greek mythology. And so what he does, he swallows Metis, and so he swallows his pregnant wife, and thinks he's done, that's the problem solved. Apparently Metis is still advising him from his belly. By the time that it comes around for Metis to give birth, Zeus has a thundering headache. And he brings along Hephaestus, god of the forge, another of those 12, 13 Olympians. And what Hephaestus does is he splits open Zeus's head to find out what it is, and out springs Athena, fully formed with all the objects that become associated with her. She has this kind of, called an aegis, it's like this breastplate, which normally has the face of the Gorgon Medusa on front. She has a shield, a spear, a helmet. She's sometimes also very much closely associated with an owl, because the owl was seen as a very wise animal by the ancient Greeks. So yes, that's the story of Athena's birth. We can talk about a few others associated with Athens, but she does become a very important goddess, and also a goddess you don't want to cross. Not just for the Athenians, but the ancient Greek world.
I guess just to end on the gods and goddesses then, who's your favourite?
Goodness. Well, none of them are my favourite, really. They all have pretty horrific stories associated with them. I mean, Demeter, I really did like the interview I did with Natalie Haynes on Demeter at the end of last year, because sometimes Demeter is a bit overlooked as, I dare I say, soft or just goddess of the harvest. But there's a real determination. She's acting as a mother, particularly when her daughter Persephone is stolen by Hades, god of the underworld, and Demeter's quest to get her daughter back is a really extraordinary one, and I recommend listening to that interview with Natalie Haynes on that. So, having done this series, I do find Demeter's story very, very interesting now, but there's just something about Hermes for me. I think Hermes is fascinating, the messenger god, but he's quite cheeky. When he's a baby, he steals a herd of cattle, I believe it's from Apollo, so he's quite a crafty little kid. Pretty disturbing story about how he creates the first liar by killing her daughters, but we'll overlook that. People can correct me if it's not a liar, but there are some really interesting stories with Hermes. So actually, I probably would say Hermes is my favourite.
And so you mentioned, if we get back to the Parthenon, you mentioned that it's built on the Acropolis. Why is that spot chosen for this building?
I think to do this, we'll go back to the beginning of the 5th century BC. So the story of the Parthenon really is the late 5th century BC when it's built. But the origins of the Parthenon, you can go back to one of the big events of classical Greek history, which is the Persian Wars. And I believe Thermopylae is shown at the beginning of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And that, of course, Battle of Thermopylae is part of the Persian Wars. So yeah, battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, Mycale, and Artemisium, and so on and so forth. But what happens during the Persian Wars? It's 480 BC. So the Athenians in 490 BC, one of their greatest prided moments is when they defeat the Persian invasion force led by King Darius I at the Battle of Marathon. And this is not very far away from Athens. Of course, Marathon, you then get later the whole story of the runner Pheidippides, and then you get the marathon in the Olympics today. Loose origins in the Battle of Marathon, but that's a story for another day. However, the second Persian invasion of Greece, this is even bigger, and this is by the Persian king Xerxes. And Xerxes, he marches a massive land force and an accompanying navy. They cross what is today kind of the Dardanelles, and the land force marches all through northern Greece, with ancient Macedonia, defeats the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. And then what happens is, there is the story of the wooden wall. And the oracle tells the Athenians to have faith in their wooden wall. And many Athenians, like Themistocles, who was the famous commander who would defeat the Persians, realised that the wooden wall was the Athenian navy. However, a few people believed that the wooden wall referred to them building a wooden wall on the Acropolis, which was still an important religious place for the Athenians at the beginning of the 5th century. So it had temples there already. A pre-Parthenon as well, if we can call it that, on the area that the Parthenon will be built on. Sadly, for the people who thought it was the wooden wall on land, they're not so fortunate, because the Persians arrive in force at Athens and they burn the Acropolis to the ground, including all the temples, the architecture on top of the Acropolis, and Athens is burned by Xerxes. The Athenians do ultimately beat this force, a combined force, at the Battle of Salamis, this famous naval battle, but the city of Athens and the Acropolis was torched. And when the Persians are finally beaten the following year at Plataea, one story is that there is an oath that is taken, the Oath of Plataea, which deems that the ruins of those buildings burned and destroyed by the Persians would not be rebuilt, and that they would be there almost like a lasting memory to make sure that something like that never happened again. So that would naturally include the ruins, like the old Parthenon, on the Acropolis of Athens. What then happens over the next few decades, once the Persian threat has been crushed in Greece, is that you have the forming of something called the Delian League, which will evolve into the Athenian Empire. Now, what happens there is you see Athens rising to the fore, right at the start. So following the defeat of the Persians, there is a league of city-states, including Sparta and Athens and Corinth and many others, that unite in this desire to liberate Greek cities that have been conquered by the Persians, and then kind of defeat the Persian threat, because they don't know whether the Persians will come back or not. So there is very much this idea of keeping the fight going, and this league will keep fighting. Sparta leaves that alliance very quickly, and Athens becomes the dominant force, and they form this league called the Delian League after the island of Delos, which is the centre of it. And over the next few decades, that league goes from being voluntary, where they're all kind of giving money into the treasury, they're giving ships, they're contributing to this combined force with Athens at its head, into Athens becoming basically the de facto leader of it, being the most powerful, forbidding powers and Greek city-states across the Greek world, particularly the Aegean, to leave. And over time, the Athenians then take direct control of the money. They also, that oath of Plataea is conveniently discarded around 450 BC. Some argue that that oath was never a thing, then that actually it was just due to money issues that they didn't clear the ruins of the Acropolis. But by 450 BC, the Athenians are in charge of this powerful Delian League, which is by then very much becoming the Athenian Empire. A lot of debate about as to when it becomes the Athenian Empire, which I'm not going to go into. But it all results that by around like 450 BC, the Athenians have a lot of money. They have the treasury, which we'll probably explore a bit more of the Delian League. And then they decide, okay, we're going to get rid of the ruins on the Acropolis. And we're going to build these beautiful new buildings, unlike anything the Greek world has ever seen. Absolutely spectacular, splendorous buildings to really promote the power and magnificence, almost the revival of Athens following the sack of the Acropolis by the Persians. And that will kickstart this massive building program called the Periclean building program, which we'll get to, no doubt, on the Acropolis.
Fascinating. So it almost goes, if there was ever this oath that they were going to leave things as they were when they were burnt by the Persians, that's almost going through a period of reflecting on that and moving into a period of, okay, now we're going to sweep away, we're going to move forward, and we're going to project our magnificence out into the Greek world. So we're done with feeling sorry for ourselves that we got bashed by the Persians, and now we're going to make something that looks spectacular. Yes,
I mean, look, but once again, as with many things with the story of the Parthenon and the background, for instance, said when this Delian League becomes an Athenian empire, there is a lot of debate around it. And some would argue that, this was, the Oath of Plataea was just an excuse for saying that they didn't have the money to build the stuff at that time. But the other point of view was that, the ruins were to make people remember, to show the barbarous nature, the barbarity of the Persians, that they would do something like this, how disrespectful the Persians had been to the gods. But yes, and then ultimately they decide, actually, we're not going to do this anymore. The Acropolis we're going to adorn with these beautiful monuments, I say, to project the power of Athens by the mid-5th century BC. Of course, something else that is sometimes suggested as the reason why they had this change of mindset around 450 BC is there is a supposed treaty, a treaty with Persia, the Treaty of Callias, so this peace treaty. So then they decide that this oath isn't valid anymore because they've finally had peace with the Persians. But then again, some even debate whether that was a thing in itself. But what we do say is that by the early 440s BC, you do start to see a massive building program beginning again on the Acropolis.
Yeah, interesting. Why is it called the Parthenon? Why is that its name? What does that mean?
Well, initially I thought, this is quite a straightforward answer. And if I'm incorrect on this, someone can absolutely let me know, because look, my main area is Alexander the Great and the successors. I've done work on the Parthenon in the past, and I've interviewed some fantastic professors on it. So it was really fun to be able to invite on this one and to kind of give an overview of this temple again. But when reading up on this, it was interesting. So the Parthenon, initially you think, it's because of the great statue of Athena Parthenos within, which we'll probably get to. And that almost certainly is a likely reason why it's called the Parthenon. This beautiful statue of this part of Athena, I think we can say, because you see with many of the gods and goddesses, they have these things called epithets, which is kind of like a word, like what they're associated with, named after them, various parts of the god or goddess. So Athena is a good example. So you have Athena Polias, Athena of the city, who's also very big in Athens and on the Acropolis. There's also Athena Promachos, which I think is basically Athena towards war or forward in war kind of thing, so hinting at that. And then there's another fascinating epithet which I love, is Athena the Owl-eyed, once again association with owls and wisdom. And then there is Athena Parthenos, Athena the maiden or Athena the virgin, and that's pointing towards Athena as one of those three virgin goddesses in the Greek pantheon, alongside Artemis, which we've already mentioned, and Hestia, goddess of the hearth. So yes, you think that the Parthenon is named after the statue, that great statue of Athena Parthenos that is created within, and that is very likely. What is interesting though, and I feel I should mention, is that when you look at mentions of the Parthenon in ancient literature, for instance, Plutarch, and I think Pausanias as well, they say in the Greek Parthenon. No, and now what I mean by that, in the ancient Greek, the O at the end, norn, it's a long omega, an omega. Going back to my A-level Greek now from many, many years back, so hopefully Mr. Bolf and Mr. Golweek and the like will be proud of me. But it is the plural. So it literally translates as of the virgins or of the maidens, which has led some to suggest that actually was this temple, was this building, was it at one stage the home of maidens who maybe were weaving sacred cloth or sacred garments for Athena? It's a theory, and it's unclear. But at least I wanted to mention it because it is interesting, the grammar, when you do actually look in detail at the word Parthenon in the ancient sources. And if anyone knows more about that, please let me know.
Yeah, very interesting. What do we know about who constructed it? Do we have any sense of who is in charge of Athens at this time, who is driving this revival in the buildings?
Well, yes, we do. Well, we get one figure who's really associated as the man who kind of kickstarts this whole building program. And in fact, his name is very much associated with it, the Periclean building program. This figure of Pericles, who was a leading Athenian statesman in the mid-5th century BC, right at the forefront of Athenian democratic politics, in the case of Athenian democracy, very different to our democracy, but hey, that is once again another topic for another day. But he's a prominent statesman for several decades, and he's a big proponent of the Athenian Empire and a big driver in the Athenian Empire. So by 450 BC, Pericles is a leading figure, and I think he's one of the main influential voices in one of these big actions that's seen as a defining moment in this transformation from that Delian League, that alliance of Greek city-states originally against the Persians, into the Athenian Empire, when he moves that league's treasury from the, albeit quite neutral, island of Delos in the Aegean to Athens. And that treasury will ultimately be placed within the Parthenon. So he's a big proponent of that, and then when they've got hold of the money in Athens, and this, I think it can be said, is one of the biggest examples of embezzlement in ancient history, is that he uses the funds from the Delian League to fund the building of this massive building program in Athens, designed to very much beautify and promote the power and stature of Athens. And one of the buildings central to that, on the Acropolis, is the Parthenon. So Pericles, he's the driving force behind the building, not just of the Parthenon, but many other buildings, using funds from this supposedly Delian League. It's evidently the Athenian Empire by this time. And I'll say again, one of the biggest cases of embezzlement in ancient Greek history.
Incredible to think you could look at the Parthenon now and think that is an example of organised crime in the 5th century BC.
Well, it's quite interesting that, because you do get, I think it's in Plutarch, who mentions that some people were opposed to this. And Plutarch is writing much later. He's a Greek historian and famous for his parallel lives. Big, very well-known figures of ancient Greek and Roman history, and kind of pairing them together, and biographies of them, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Pyrrhus, Sertorius, and so on and so forth. I think he mentions at one case, because he does fleetingly talk about the Parthenon, including three of the architects, two architects and one sculptor. The architects are people called Iktinos and Callicrates, and the sculptor is a man called Phidias, who we'll probably get back to. But during that, he also mentions how there was some displeasure with the use of these funds to kind of, and I think it's like prettifying Athens like a whore is sometimes how Plutarch is paraphrased, but that was kind of the line of attack. We are using all these funds basically just to beautify Athens.
And do we have a sense, so obviously in the medieval world I deal with lots of castles. People always want to know, how did people build castles in a time before machinery and all of that sort of stuff? So if we go back, another 1,500,000 years, how are people building something like the Parthenon in ancient Greece? Clearly very well, because it still stands today. But do we have any sense of the kind of building technologies and materials that they're using to achieve that?
The Athenians were meticulous record keepers. So it's quite interesting that in their bureaucracy, we have an idea when the building of the Parthenon starts, which is around 447 BC, from these records. And also we have early mentions of the materials that are gathered for it. What is amazing about the Parthenon is that it's built entirely out of marble. There have been older temples built partly of marble, but never entirely of marble. Even the roof tiles are made of marble, supposedly, for the Parthenon. So it is built entirely of marble, and not just that, like the best marble that the Athenians knew of, because Athens had a great source of marble very close on the Attic Peninsula, which is where Athens is located, Attica. Just a bit to the south. Two of the great natural resources that the Athenians in their area they're blessed with is marble from Mount Pentelicon and silver from the Laurian mines. So Laurian mines, I might get that pronunciation wrong there, so my apologies. And the silver mines are also very important in the growing, the enriching of Athens at this time. But the marble, this fine marble, is quarried out of Mount Pentelicon, and that's mentioned in the records, and then brought up to the Acropolis, maybe on ramps, and obviously they got wheeled transport, so brought up into the Parthenon. Remember, this takes more than a decade to build. But what's quite interesting in regards to the building techniques, what is also mentioned is a lot of wood being brought to the Parthenon. So that would probably hint at, it's been suggested scaffolding, which would make sense when you're erecting these columns and ultimately the pediments and so on and so forth. Yes, they would have had some sorts of machinery like cranes, iron tools, and very, very good architects. We know that from some of the architectural details of the Parthenon are absolutely stunning, and one of the key reasons as to why the Parthenon of all ancient Greek temples is regarded as the most beautiful or amongst the most beautiful. But I couldn't give you the absolute details of how every part of it was built. But you do get at least a bit of a sense of some of those key building materials with those records, like the mentioning of wood at the beginning.
Do we have an idea when it's finished of what the Parthenon would have looked like at its peak, when it's newly built, when it's being opened? Do we have descriptions of it, precisely what it looked like, or can it be reconstructed from what survives today?
We have fleeting mentions of it, what it looked like when it was built from the 5th century BC, and those largely come from, when I mean fleeting, I mean very, very fleeting. So Aristophanes, the famous comedic playwright at the end of the 5th century, in a couple of his plays, for instance, his Knights and Lysistrata, both of those mention either the Parthenon or the statue of Athena Parthenos within. The Knights refers to the big hands, the big ivory hands of the Athena Parthenos statue. We'll get back to those materials, no doubt. And we do hear like little eyewitness accounts of it. I think there's a man called Heraclides of Crete who visits in the 3rd century BC, and he talks about like the sumptuous temple of Athena stands out and is well worth a look. It is called the Parthenon and is on the hill above the theatre. And the theatre, I think it's the Dionysiac Theatre, but it's where those performances were taking place, and another key building of the Periclean building programme. And Heraclides talks about how it makes an amazing impression on visitors. But yes, we do, either from reconstructions or mentions of what visitors saw of it throughout history, not just in ancient history, and also with certain parts of it that didn't survive, we don't really get many records of apart from fleeting mentions. Let's say the statue of Athena Parthenos, for whom we have an account by Pausanias a few centuries later, this travel writer, but there are also kind of copies of the statue which have been used to get more idea of the details of that statue. Yes, we have a pretty good idea of its design. Would you like me to go through it?
I think that'd be really helpful, yeah. I mean, players in the game can go and explore this temple. I think it'd be really nice to understand, hopefully, how accurate it is when they're walking through it, and what those parts of the buildings were for when you run through them. Okay,
well, let's do that. So I think the first thing to say, I remember talking to Dr. Maeve McHugh about this from the University of Birmingham, basically saying how the Parthenon is an ancient Greek temple, but it's been turned up to 11 because it's built completely out of marble, and it has those hallmarks of ancient Greek temples. But I think the first thing for me to point out, if we look at the exterior first off, let's say we're staring at the outside of the Parthenon at the top of the Acropolis. The first thing for me to highlight is a particular architectural style of Greek temples, which was very prominent in the preceding century, in the 6th century BC, so the Archaic period, and this was known as the Doric order, so Doric temple styles. And great examples of that survive. For instance, one of my favourites is in southern Italy, a place called Paestum, ancient Greek Poseidonia, and there are a few ancient Greek temples there which are very much this Doric style, and the Parthenon replicates it, even though it's built when I think the Doric order, I wouldn't say it's fallen out of fashion, but it's seen as quite an old style by them, which might hint that the people who built the Parthenon wanted it to look older than it actually was. What you notice first of all with the Parthenon is this large colonnade, And it is a large colonnade. Each of these columns is a Doric column, so they're these large fluted columns, not much other decoration on them, all completely made of marble. 8 along the width of each end, and then 17 along the length of either side of the colonnade. So I think that's 46 columns around the outside, the exterior. And what is interesting with these columns is you won't really be able to see with the naked eye because it's such a small adjustment, but it shows the real capabilities of these architects, is that they bulge slightly in the middle. It's a thing called entasis, and this is an optical illusion. And also they bend inward slightly as well, very slightly inwards. Because if they were completely straight and you looked at the Parthenon from afar, let's say you're approaching Athens or something, the columns would not look straight. If they were straight, it's really confusing. Don't get me into the details with it. However, if you do that slight illusion by make it bulge slightly in the middle, make it lean slightly inwards, and I think on the end columns at either end are also slightly larger, those little tweaks, tiny tweaks, ensure that when someone sees it from afar, the columns look completely straight.
I do remember hearing something about there being an optical illusion in the way that they're built to make them look kind of straight from the right kind of distance. I wasn't sure if I'd made that up, so I didn't want to ask that question, so I'm quite glad you brought that up.
It's absolutely right. The columns are Doric columns, and then above the Doric columns you have this beautiful sculpture, almost kind of strip cartoon-like sculpture. You see different scenes, mythical scenes around the lengths and widths, so each side shows a different kind of mythological scene, and they're like strip cartoons because you see episodes of that scene in each kind of squarish bit of sculpture, squarish area of the templed face, and it shows a particular character to fill up that sculpted area. Particular sculptures would have probably been painted, and we know that they may have had bronze armour on as well, and divided them up. You have these 3 vertical lines between each of these little kind of snippets, and they're called triglyphs. So you get the metopes, which are these sculptures in these little square episodic parts of the Parthenon, and then you get triglyphs, these 3 vertical lines, this stylistic design dividing them up, and they go all the way around, and that's very iconic of Doric temples too.
And what kind of stories do they tell us? Can you give us an example of one of the images that we can see there?
They're all mythological scenes, and I think they're very much their heart showing Athenian victory over the Persians. Because another reason the Parthenon is built supposedly is to celebrate Athens, reviving from the Persians and their ultimate victory against the Persians. So on one side you have the Trojan War. So you think Achilles and Hector, Agamemnon, Menelaus, so Greeks versus Trojans, and the Trojans here very much seen as Persians, I guess. Then you have something called a Centauromachy, which is showing 2 mythological creatures, centaurs and lapiths. The centaurs have been invited to a wedding of the lapiths, and the centaurs have a bit too much to drink, and they start trying to seize the lapith women and start fighting and brawling, and you see the lapiths resisting and fighting against them, and the women fighting too. Then the next one, you have a Titanomachy, the fight of the Titans, so the Olympian gods versus the Titans, kind of once again the battle of the heavens. And the final one, if I remember correctly, is a Amazonomachy, or Amazonmachy, which is a battle with the Amazons, Greeks fighting Amazons. So those are the 4 different mythological scenes represented in these metopes, or the strip cartoons like on each side, each of the 4 sides. Within that kind of Doric exterior is you get Ionic elements, which are more kind of... The Parthenon mixes these 2 architectural orders together. An Ionic order is defined by these different styles of columns, which I don't think you see on the Parthenon, but rather than having those metopes and triglyphs that I mentioned earlier, instead it has a continuous frieze all around it. And what you have further in on the Parthenon is you have this continuous frieze, and part of that you can see in the British Museum, and a significant part you can also see at the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And there's debate about what it shows, but I believe it does show the Panathenaic procession, this important procession that ended up on the Acropolis and was once every 4 years, this great festival to Athena. Going on from that, in the interior of the Parthenon there were 2 different rooms, but the main room housed this beautiful statue, 12 meters tall, of Athena Parthenos, and we don't have that surviving, which we'll get to in a moment, but Pausanias describes part of it, and we can understand more of it from replicas, copies of it from Roman times, and it shows Athena standing upright with her classic objects like the helmet, an aegis, breastplate, spear, shield. There's a depiction of a snake, which is believed to be a legendary early king of Athens who was born from the ground and was adopted by Athena. There's a big story about that, and Athena, Hephaestus, and ejaculation, which maybe we should talk about another time. We probably don't have enough time, but that's associated with Athens. And there was a big pool of water in front to keep the ivory okay. So that ivory and gold statue is there, beautiful statue, adorned with decoration and different scenes. I think there's Greeks fighting Amazons, there's the depiction of Pandora, the first woman as well. Could talk much more about that, but I know we don't have time. The last thing I will say about the decoration is the two pediments right on top. Now, the pediments are the triangular bit right on top of the Parthenon. They both show main stories of Athena. One of them shows a main story of Athena and Athens. One on one side shows the birth of Athena, which I've already mentioned, her exploding from the head of Zeus. The other one shows the mythical story of how Athena becomes the patron deity of Athens, which is a competition with Poseidon, god of the sea. And this kind of display supposedly of ancient Athenian democracy, where Athena and Poseidon on the Acropolis, they show what they can offer to the Athenians. Poseidon offers them water, hits the ground with his staff, and water springs out. However, it's salt water. So the Athenians aren't that happy about that. And then Athena gives them olives. So olives gives you shelter, olive trees, shelter from the sun, but also it's a commodity, olive oil, and they choose Athena. So that myth is also shown the other end.
It's interesting that the Persians don't directly make it into there. Is it almost like an effort to say the Persians weren't even the greatest people we've defeated? We've defeated all of these people as well, almost ignoring the Persians.
I don't know about that, because I don't think the Athenians want to say that they defeated all these, like the gods and goddesses, because they're not fighting the Titans. I think like these different peoples, these foreign peoples, like the Amazons, like the Trojans, maybe the Centaurs as well. I think, first of all, they would all be very recognisable myths. Now, you've got to remember with these metopes that they are more than 12 metres above the ground. So you don't want any writing, you just want to show the sculpture, but people to immediately recognise what is being shown from the sculpture. I think the other thing to show is that, like many temples, because they're associated with deities, show mythological scenes. The interesting thing with the Parthenon is that there's one scene which is likely not mythological, which is the continuous frieze, which is a bit further in, which is very much a not Doric element. It's more of an Ionic order element, which is more of the time in Athens, which we might get to, which might show the Panathenaic procession, this big procession of Athens in the 5th century BC. But I think it is more to show, to align with other classical Greek temples, let's say the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, which show mythological scenes. And some of these mythical races, like the Amazons, like the Trojans, are in this case being represented as the foreigner, like the Persians were, and the barbarian, basically.
Yeah, it's just the victory of civilization over the barbarians.
Well, at least what they thought. Some would argue that the Persians actually, the Greeks borrowed a lot from the Persians, so it's not that straightforward, but anyway, that's another discussion.
What do we know about the kind of people who used it? So if this is a temple, but it's also a treasury, do we have a sense of the kind of people who were milling around there all day? Was it a place of business, a place of worship, a bit of both?
Place of worship, absolutely. This is still like the religious heart of Athens, because you have other temples that are ultimately built, like the Erechtheion, which houses the very important small statue of Athena Polias, the olive wood statue, which is also where this great procession ended. So you would still imagine priests and priestesses being in this area of Athens, and we do hear of particular priestesses like Lysimache, who may well be an influence for the main protagonist in one of Aristophanes' plays, Lysistrata, in which women take control of the Acropolis in a sex strike because they want the Athenians to stop fighting the Spartans, and they seize the Parthenon and the Acropolis. It's a very, very funny play. What I think you should also think about is guards. This is a treasury at the end of the day. This was where the money was. And of course you've got this great gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos within, 12 metres high, this statue. So there will be guards patrolling the outside of the building. Now, how these guards are dressed may well be hoplites with their spear and shield, the heavy Greek infantrymen that is associated with classical Greek warfare right at the centre of it. There's mention, of course, of Scythian archers, which were this police force at the time. I don't know if it would be Scythian archers guarding the treasury, but I think, you should imagine, priests and priestesses in the vicinity, because the Acropolis was still a very sacred, important area where sacrifices did happen, but also guards. I don't know much else about other people being able to mill about. But those are two types of people that you should think about when you're thinking about the 5th century Acropolis.
And what do we know about what happens to the Parthenon as the classical world begins to fade, I guess? Does the Parthenon retain its importance to Athens? Does it find another use for itself?
It definitely still finds another use for itself, because it becomes one of the defining buildings of classical Athens. It was the treasury. It's defined as a temple, but it's also a treasury, so all this money was held, and votive offerings too are mentioned as being within the Parthenon. And what's quite interesting, when it is in classical Athens time, when Athens is at its height, when that Delian League has been transformed into the Athenian Empire, that big procession that happens every 4 years, the allies, the people in the league, the empire really, they're forced to attend the Panathenaic procession, bring a suit of armour and I think an ox for sacrifice, and they would march with this procession all the way up to the Acropolis, and then they would see the great ancient entranceway to the Acropolis known as the Propylaea, also built with the funds of the treasury. They would see the Parthenon, and so they would almost be forced to see what the Athenians have created, partly with their money. So, at that time, first off, it's a statement of Athenian power.
I was just wondering how many of those were marching towards it, going, "Oh, great, this is what we paid for."
There are interesting cases where certain city-states try to leave this league, and the Athenians basically turn up as like, "Are you really sure about that?" With their big navy and everything, and would you like to reconsider? It becomes an empire. As time goes on, so the Athenian Empire comes crumbling down at the end of the war called the Peloponnesian War, and this kind of height of Athens as an imperial power over the next century fades. But the Athenians, they're very proud of their history. And for instance, you get to see by the time of Alexander the Great, when Athens is just one, shall we say, it's a medium power by this time. It no longer has the great empire that it once did, but it still harkens back to that time when it was like kind of this great leader of what is always like kind of the civilized, the Greek world. And so a few of them don't like being under Macedonian leadership with Alexander the Great and his successors, and so there are times where they try to break free, they don't work, and there's quite a big retribution which happens to the Athenians. My mind goes to the Lamian War, which happens after Alexander the Great, but the Parthenon is still there. The Parthenon is still this shining beacon, this beautiful temple. And you see warlords in that Hellenistic period, that rise following the death of Alexander the Great, and fight over his empire. Warlords fight over Athens and the Acropolis, and one particular warlord is a man called Demetrius the Besieger. And he at first is welcomed into Athens. He's got this big army, and he is very fond of Athens. So the Athenians initially, they have a good thoughts towards him. But then after a bit of time, Demetrius, he establishes his house, his residency in the sacred Parthenon. And Demetrius is known as a bit of a playboy. He's a lot of courtesans, prostitutes who live with him, which is a very interesting moment in the Parthenon. A kind of a fall from grace, I think, is very much emphasised in Plutarch's accounts there. But then, over time, the Parthenon is kind of robbed of the gold of the statue of Athena Polias. There's like civil wars of Athens. Then the Romans come a bit later. Sulla, there's a great sack of Athens, and I think a lot of the treasures of Athens are sacked then, brought to Rome, taken away from the Acropolis, including from the Parthenon. You then get a massive sack of Athens in the 3rd century by a Germanic people called the Heruli, which is probably when the Parthenon there's a massive fire of the Parthenon and the statue is destroyed. So that's when the statue of Athena Parthenos is gone. And then you get a bit later the emergence of Christianity. So Christianity becomes the state religion, Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. And around that time you see a lot of, I've got like kind of quotation marks, like pagan, Greek religion, Roman religion, buildings associated with deities either destroyed, or if they're fortunate, they are transformed into churches. And some of the best preserved buildings we have from antiquity are those which continue to be used because they're transformed into churches. And a great example in Rome is the Pantheon. The Pantheon in Rome, striking building. And the Parthenon is another example. It's converted into the Church of the Virgin Mary. So there you go. One virgin divine figure to another virgin divine figure, from Athena to Mary. There is some consequences for this in the fact that many of the mythological scenes on the Parthenon that we've mentioned earlier are defaced, because, it doesn't suit with Christian beliefs. I think some of them, however, aren't. I think one of the pediments is interfaced. I believe it is the Athena versus Poseidon contest, but I might be wrong on that one. And it remains a church for several centuries until Athens is conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and it goes from church into a mosque. So it then becomes a mosque for a few centuries until you get to the 17th century, and a siege of Athens by the Venetians. I think it's 1687, September 1687, when the Venetians, they're attacking Athens and they're bombarding Athens. I think it's by ship. And the Ottomans store their gunpowder in the Parthenon, thinking that the Venetians wouldn't strike it. They do. And the gunpowder store explodes, and a lot of the Parthenon is exploded. And so, yeah, you get parts of the Parthenon falling off. Some parts of that are then taken by Lord Elgin, and that's why some of the Parthenon marbles, also sometimes known as the Elgin marbles, have ended up controversially at the British Museum today. We must mention that. Since then, it's a place that lots of people go and visit. Grand Tour, famous figures. I think Byron goes and visits the Acropolis. Many young gents who want to go and see the classical architecture, they go and visit the Parthenon. It's a must-see on their list of places to go. There are attempts of reconstructing it as well, and I think the most recent reconstructing and kind of repairing of parts of the Parthenon is ongoing to the present day. So the Parthenon is a story that is very much part of ancient Greek history today. It's a shining monument of it, and it's one that's never really very far away from the newspapers because of controversies. But I mean, I've very much glossed over the whole legacy. I've kind of talked about some of the big events. The legacy of the Parthenon is absolutely a podcast episode in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible to think it's a 2,500-year-old building, but it's still alive today. You know, it still has a role. It's still the centre of lots of study and rebuilding and everything else. It's been a focus for Athens' religious life and its social life, and it still is today. You know, people go to Athens to visit the Parthenon, to be connected to that 2,500 years of history there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I find really interesting, and I read about this recently, is I went to university at the University of Edinburgh, and there's a hill in Edinburgh called Carlton Hill. And you'll notice on Carlton Hill that there's like the start of what looks like a Parthenon-like temple, an ancient Greek temple. And reading up a bit on this was to commemorate the Battle of Waterloo. In Edinburgh, initially there is constructed, or they wanted to build their own Parthenon in Edinburgh, but it was never finished. So you see kind of unfinished beginnings of a Parthenon in Edinburgh today on Carlton Hill. And of course then there is the completely reconstructed Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, with also the great gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos within, although they didn't put that more than 1,000 kilograms worth of gold, or 40 talents worth of gold on the statue as there was on the original. So yes, there are certain reconstructions. So yeah, you know, the legacy of the Parthenon is another story, and there are many better people to talk through it than I am. Centre of religious life, well, the Acropolis, religiously important. Statement of power for when Athens was an imperial power. A legacy of classical Athens, and Athens at its height. A legacy of Pericles. And architecturally and artistically, one of the most beautifully designed and carefully designed. I either mentioned those kind of little optical illusion architectural details, and the artistic continuous frieze, the metopes, the pediments, all that sculpture is beautiful down to the present day. All of these things result in its legacy enduring to the present day, as, you know, sometimes cheesily said, as an eighth wonder of the world. But I don't like giving numbers to the things. It is a wonder of the world.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Tristan, to talk us through the Parthenon and its history, and also to give us a glimpse of that pantheon of gods as well, to try and place some of them in my mind, because not my area of expertise at all. But I've thoroughly enjoyed heading back to ancient Greece to find out more about the Parthenon, its building and its function and its role. It's been absolutely incredible. Where can people go to find out even more from the Ancients podcast?
Well, you can search the Ancients podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from. You know, we cover everything from the origins of life on Earth to the fall of Rome. So yeah, got a big time period to focus on. Makes medieval period look very small, I must admit. But we like a challenge on the Ancients. Release 2 episodes a week, and we've done one on the Parthenon in the past with Maeve McHugh. It was great, and it's been a pleasure to revisit it today.
Yeah, no, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. Are you still here? Click a link, watch a video. It's much better than watching me tell you to go and watch a video.